As much as I want to keep to my plan of reviewing recently released titles, I sometimes come across something that's far too interesting to ignore. Which does not explain why I'm reviewing it 2 years late, but shush. Dropsy was released in 2015, it stars this derpy looking bastard, features some particularly stylised retro graphics and has no dialogue whatsoever. Sure, NPCs will communicate with you, mostly to say fuck off gimpy clown, but they use speech bubbles with pictures in them. Essentially, this is a game that doesn't need a translation, unless a sad face means something different in your country to what it does in mine. I haven't seen anyone take this approach since Machinarium, and I was pretty damn late in covering that one as it was, so yeah, been a while. Thankfully that's not the only unique feature Dropsy has to offer, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We've got story to do. Clown in circus. Clown happy. Circus on fire. Clown sad. Clown walk through burning circus. Clown frightened. Clown eaten by floor monster. Clown wake up. Okay, I normally have a lot more concrete information to go on here. The only words that appear in the game are either on the title menu, the save load screen, or it's in this language which doesn't really communicate anything. Turns out there's a straight cipher to English for these, but that still doesn't communicate anything unless you stop and translate them all. There's a potential pitfall with a wordless game. If something isn't clear, the player's forced to guess. I don't even know if this clown's name is actually Dropsy, but that's what I'm going with. Side note, Dropsy also means the increase of interstitial fluid in any organ, which may explain why our protagonist does actions like this. But then again, maybe it doesn't. Okay, this game looks weird, I know this, but I think there's a lot to like here, a lot done right. So I'd best get to explaining that, hadn't I? Interface, we'll do interface, why not? All you'll need is the left mouse button for this one. It interacts with the world, with your inventory, with yourself. Does everything. Most of these actions are hidden inside a pop-out widget at the top of the screen, where you can access the aforementioned inventory, take direct control of the various animal friends you pick up on your journey, who all have their own abilities and uses, or access the hug action. That pretty much sums up Dropsy right there. Just a derpy clown who wants to hug the world. Including the trees. And statues. There's also a map in that widget, but it doesn't let you fast travel, not at first anyway. You can unlock a car later on, but even then you need to keep track of where you park your freaky-faced automobile. That's when the game doesn't teleport you to another location as part of the story, forcing our poor clown to retrieve his car on foot. Clown car. Anyway, back to the map. What it does do is mark where your most pressing objective lies, even if it doesn't tell you what to do once you get there. The reason I said most pressing objective is because there's numerous puzzles you could solve in seemingly no particular order. Primarily making people happier by helping with their problems. People who, for the most part, seem to hate Dropsy because they think he caused the big circus tent fire from the intro. So there's a bit of a hurdle to jump, sure, but it can be done. Doesn't need to be done though. I feel like it's there for those of us who enjoy tidying up, going into a world, fixing the problems, and making everything neat and tidy. And as someone who put far too many hours into caring for my Fallout 4 settlements, that very much ticks a box for me. This make the world better approach is where Dropsy meets another potential pitfall. Some items will only be relevant to happy making rather than story progression, so if you're only looking to complete the game, you'll find a lot of red herring items that won't get you to the ending any faster. In theory, I quite like this idea. I was always a fan of giving the player multiple objectives so when they get stuck, they can go work on something else for a while. Only real difference here is that some of the objectives aren't mandatory for finishing the game. As for the ones which are mandatory, they're relatively straightforward. Old school object inventory puzzles, but they make sense. Given the lack of language, they generally do a pretty good job of communicating what items are and what characters are talking about. Simplified, of course, but it was a rare moment where I had to repeat a conversation to get the info I needed. Then they throw a restricted vision maze puzzle at you, because nothing can be perfect apparently. At least it's short. I didn't think I would have much to say on the graphics front, being retro looking pixel art and all, and yet I've written these words, recorded myself saying the words, and edited them into a video without deleting them at any point, so they're probably important. Dropsy actually serves as a good contrast to the more popular retro look. The animation is imaginative, and when your protagonist looks like this, you have to go weird with it, it's the only option. The game is basically a cartoon anyway, so it's a good choice. The dream sequences are good examples of everything this game does different in the graphics department, with many an interesting shader type effect to creep you out with. A substantial effort when you add in the fact that every outdoor background needs 4 different images for the 4 times of day, because this game has a day-night cycle. That's not something you see very often, is it? As you might expect, this means people are at different places depending on the hour, some locations are closed at night, some are only open at night, and so on. If this sounds like an annoyance, worry not. There's a few spots around the world where Dropsy can have a wee snooze and skip to whatever time of day he likes, even if it means skipping in a dingy alley, that'll go well. This opens up the puzzle variety significantly, and it could almost be too much when you remember that you've got your entire inventory and the abilities of your animal friends to consider as possibilities while solving a puzzle. The old use everything on everything tactic won't serve you well here. And when you combine this day-night cycle with the size of the game area, you have something I'm dangerously tempted to call open world. Like Thimbleweed Park, it has a mixture of indoor and outdoor scenes, a town area, more rural areas, plus you can, and most likely will, walk from one end to the other in a single run. Factor in the multiple objectives that you can tackle in pretty much any order, and it feels very open. Where Dropsy differs from Thimbleweed Park is that the day-night cycle makes it feel a lot less static, like an actual little world, helped in part by a soundtrack which, whilst eclectic, is more often than not quite relaxing, with emphasis on saxophone. Not enough saxophone in game soundtracks, that's what I say. It's a sizable game world for Dropsy to go out and comprehend, as much as it's possible for him to do so. Speaking of, if you'll permit me a bit of theorising for a minute, I was thinking about the reason this game has no written dialogue, and that led me to one question. Can Dropsy communicate with people? The only noises he ever makes are simplistic. Yelps of joy or fear, sad moans and sighs. That implies a very underdeveloped set of communication skills. Yet he seems to understand other people to an extent. Not the nuances, perhaps nothing that could be translated into a sentence, but there is understanding there. He doesn't just know that person is sad, he knows why they're sad. Otherwise there wouldn't be the related identifying picture next to the sad face. Perhaps these poor language skills come about as Dropsy clearly lives outside of normal society. Whatever horrible, fire-intensive fate befell this circus tent, it's kept everyone but this old man away. And a red-nosed dog. And a chicken, but he's mostly there to steal things. What I find really interesting about this game is not only the non-verbal nature of its narrative, it's the fact that it's surprisingly non-violent, considering it's likely not for children if you go by the topics it covers. More than one character is dealing with the loss of a loved one, you visit graveyards, you see the remains of living beings at points, and the hostility Dropsy receives from the local populace must be quite harrowing for him. And yet, in the face of all that negativity, he remains the loveliest protagonist I think I've ever played as. At least until I run out of new releases and end up covering Putt Putt Goes to the Moon or something. Most point-and-click protagonists will do something wrong, questionable, or mean in the course of their adventures. Looking at you, Stobart. Dropsy wants to make people happy, and that's basically it. Anything he does is to help other people, not himself. Not directly anyway, he probably wants people to think better of him. Still, a step up from this guy. I'm really glad I played this when I did, considering the last few games I've tried involved some rather heavy life business. Important life business worth talking about, and granted Dropsy starts off in a similarly heavy fashion, but by sheer force of wholesome will it turns it around in a way I think only a fantastical cartoon adventure can. It's a very old school game in some ways, in terms of graphics and puzzle design, but very new school in others, such as its open world nature. If you're looking for a dose of wholesome packaged up in a nicely crafted pointy click, give Dropsy a try.